The Duke of Wexford walked into the most important ballroom in London, and 200 women held their breath. Every one of them had spent weeks preparing for this night. Silk. Diamonds. Names whispered like prayers. He did not look at any of them. He crossed the entire length of the room past the daughters of earls, past the daughters of lords, and stopped in front of a woman standing near the library doors in a plain ivory dress with no jewels at all. The room fell silent. She looked up at him. He said quietly but clearly enough for everyone near them to hear, "I have been searching for you." Before we begin, subscribe to the Duke's Diary and stay with this story until the very last word. And tell me in the comments which city are you watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Eleanor Whitcombe had not wanted to come. She had said this to her Aunt Harriet 3 times in the carriage, once calmly, once more firmly, and once with the quiet desperation of a woman who knows she has already lost the argument but refuses to surrender without record. Aunt Harriet had responded to all 3 by adjusting her gloves and saying that a woman of 27 who turned down invitations to Hartwell House was a woman who intended to grow old alone, and that Eleanor's intentions on this particular subject were, in her considered opinion, not yet fixed enough to be trusted. So Eleanor had come. She had worn the ivory dress because it was the best thing she owned that still fit properly, and because she refused to dress herself in borrowed jewelry like a borrowed life. She had pinned her dark hair, simply added nothing, changed nothing, and walked into the Hartwell ballroom with the expression of someone who had accepted a situation and intended to manage it with dignity. She had found a position near the library doors within 4 minutes. This was not a retreat. This was, Eleanor had decided, a strategic location. From here she could see the room without being required to participate in it fully. She could watch Lady Ashworth's daughters circle the floor with their expensive gowns and their expensive smiles. She could observe the way that wealth arranged itself in a room, the way people clustered around it, the way conversations shifted direction when a title entered. She found it genuinely interesting, in the way she found most things genuinely interesting, which was perhaps her fundamental problem with London society. Since London society preferred to be admired rather than studied, she was deep in a conversation about Flemish cartography with Sir Edmund Graves, a man of 70, who had traveled widely and had opinions about everything, and was, Eleanor had concluded within 5 minutes, by far the most interesting person in the room when she became aware that something had shifted. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound. The particular held quality of a large room catching its breath. She did not look up immediately. Sir Edmund had just reached the most interesting part of his account of a particular map he had seen in Amsterdam, and she was not going to abandon it simply because the room had decided to pay attention to something. Then Sir Edmund stopped speaking. Eleanor looked up. The Duke of Wexford had entered from the far end of the ballroom. She recognized him the way she recognized things she had read about, rather than experienced an approximation rendered precise. She had heard the name dozens of times. She had formed from those hearings a general impression. Powerful, cold, a man who moved through English society like weather affecting everything and answering to nothing. He was 36. He had inherited at 22. He had never married despite 3 seasons of being the most sought match in England. People explained this in various ways. His standards were impossibly high. He found women tiresome. He was still mourning some private loss no one fully understood. Looking at him now, Eleanor thought he is exhausted. It was not something you could see exactly if you were looking for wealth or status or power. It was something you saw if you were in the habit of looking at people rather than at what they represented. The way he carried his shoulders, the way his eyes moved through the room, not arrogant, not calculating, tired. And then those eyes stopped moving. They stopped on her. She did not look away. Looking away would have been in Eleanor's estimation a form of dishonesty, and she was not in the habit of dishonesty regardless of how inconvenient the alternative was. She met his gaze directly. He held it for a moment. Then he began to walk toward her. The room felt the movement before it understood the direction. She could see it happen, the slow recognition spreading outward from the women nearest the door, the way heads turned, the way conversations fractured in the middle of sentences. Lady Ashworth's eldest daughter, positioned perfectly near the center of the floor, in a gown that had probably cost more than Eleanor's quarterly income, visibly composed herself in readiness. 3 other women did the same. Small adjustments. Posture. Expression. The rapid calculus of readiness. The Duke walked past all of them. He walked the full length of the ballroom. He did not look to either side. He did not pause. He came directly to the place where Eleanor was standing beside Sir Edmund Graves and the library doors, and he stopped. Sir Edmund, to his eternal credit, looked absolutely delighted. "Your Grace," Eleanor said. She kept her voice entirely even. She had not prepared for this, and she was not going to pretend she had. "Miss Whitcombe," said the Duke. She stared at him. "You know my name?" "Yes." "We have not been introduced." "No." He said it without apology, without evasion. Factual. "I took the liberty of asking." "Of asking whom?" "Lady Hartwell's social secretary." The faintest thing moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The acknowledgement that a smile was possible. "I was told your name, and that you were, according to her, the only person in the room currently discussing cartography, which I found significant." Sir Edmund made a sound that might have been a laugh, turned it neatly into a cough, and suddenly discovered an urgent need to speak to someone across the room. Eleanor watched him go. Then she looked back at the Duke. "Significant," she said. "In the context of this particular room, yes. Most people would say it was eccentric. Most people in this room," he said, "have been discussing the same 4 topics for the past 2 hours. The weather. The season. Who is engaged? Who should be?" He paused. "Cartography is a notable deviation." Eleanor considered him. She was aware with the peripheral awareness she maintained in social situations the way other women maintained perfect posture that half the room was watching. She was aware that this was unprecedented. She was aware that she was supposed to feel overwhelmed or flattered or flustered, and that the absence of these feelings was probably itself unusual. "What are you actually doing here?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I beg your pardon. Not at the ball in general. Here, specifically, at this end of the room." She tilted her head very slightly. "You could have spoken to Lady Ashworth's daughter. She was positioned very well, and has clearly been hoping for exactly this conversation for the better part of an hour. Instead, you walked the full length of the room to speak to a woman you had to ask a secretary to identify. So I am asking what you are actually doing." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, she had been ready for offense. Not the flat indifference of a man who had decided the conversation was beneath him. Something she had not expected at all: interest. Genuine, unguarded, almost startled interest, like a man who has reached for something familiar and found something entirely different. "You left the ballroom," he said. "While everyone else was trying to be seen. I did not leave the ballroom. I relocated to an area with more interesting conversation." "Why?" "Because the alternative was to stand in the center of the floor performing contentment until someone decided to notice me, and I find that particular performance tiresome." "You didn't try to be noticed." "No." "Why not?" Eleanor looked at him levelly. "Because I prefer being known to being noticed. They are not the same thing in my experience." Another silence. Shorter this time. Different in quality from the first, less calculating, more considering. "No," he said quietly. "They are not." Lady Hartwell appeared at that precise moment, with the inevitability of a hostess who has sensed an unusual social configuration and arrived to manage it. She was a small woman of immense social authority, and she looked between Eleanor and the Duke with the expression of someone doing extremely rapid mental calculations. "Your Grace," she said smoothly. "I see you have found Miss Whitcombe." "She was not difficult to find," Alexander said. "She was having the most interesting conversation in the room." Lady Hartwell blinked. She had not expected that. She recovered immediately. Years of hostessing had made her essentially unflappable, and said, "Miss Whitcombe has always been a charming conversationalist," in the specific tone of a compliment that is technically sincere, while implying that the quality mentioned is surprising. Eleanor smiled at Lady Hartwell with absolute pleasantness and said nothing. "Perhaps," Lady Hartwell continued, "His Grace would like to join the dancing. The next set is about to begin, and I know several." "I don't dance," Alexander said. Lady Hartwell's smile held. "Of course, Your Grace." She retreated with the grace of a woman who understood when she had been outmaneuvered. Eleanor turned back to the Duke. "That was not entirely kind." "I am not here to be kind to Lady Hartwell." He looked at her directly. "I am here because I wanted to speak to you." "You said that. You haven't yet explained why." He was quiet for a moment. Not a calculating quiet, a genuine one, the quiet of a man deciding how much of the truth to offer. "Your father," he said, "was Professor William Whitcombe." Eleanor went very still. "Yes," she said. "He died 4 years ago." "Yes. He wrote extensively on historical land records, the documentation of estate rights, the legal frameworks of inherited property." He paused. "I read his work, extensively, during a particularly difficult period when I had inherited this dukedom at 22 and had no idea what that actually required of a man." Eleanor looked at him. The ballroom moved around them, the music, the voices, the elaborate social performance of the season, continuing its business on all sides, and she felt something she had not expected to feel at a ball on a Tuesday evening in March, the quality of being in a conversation that mattered. "He was very good," she said carefully. "How was exceptional?" There was nothing performative in the word. He said it the way he said everything, simply, directly, as though the truth required no decoration. There was a passage in his work on the moral obligations of inherited title. He wrote that a man who inherits power without earning wisdom has received a gift he doesn't yet know how to hold. That the first duty of a new lord is not to his estate, but to his own education in decency. Eleanor's throat tightened, small and brief. She controlled it. "I remember when he wrote that," she said. "He was working on the 3rd volume. He used to read passages aloud at dinner." A pause. "He said the most dangerous man in England was an arrogant heir with an excellent solicitor." For the first time, the almost smile became something more definite. "That is exactly the passage that follows the one I quoted. You know it that well. I have read that book 11 times. He said it without embarrassment, without any sense that this admission was unusual. "I read it first in the week after my father's funeral. I read it again before my first appearance in Parliament. I read it again when I almost made a decision regarding our tenants that would have been legally defensible and morally indefensible." He paused. "Your father's work prevented me from making that mistake." The music shifted into something slower. Around them, couples formed on the floor. The room's attention, which had been fixed on the unusual spectacle of the Duke standing by the library doors, had gradually returned to its own business, or at least was performing the return, since Eleanor could feel the peripheral watching, still the awareness of a room, deciding what narrative it was witnessing. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Tonight. Here. Because I have intended to tell you for 3 years," he said, "and I have not managed it." He held her gaze steadily. "I wanted you to know that his work mattered, that it changed something real, that he is not simply remembered by people who attended his academic lectures, that he reached someone he would never have expected to reach at exactly the moment that person needed reaching." Eleanor breathed. She had spent 4 years since her father's death receiving condolences. Comfortable, careful, well-meaning words about a fine man and a distinguished career and a sad loss. She had received exactly 3 conversations in those 4 years that had felt like someone actually saw who he had been. Not his title as an academic, not his publications, but the quality of his thinking, the specific and genuine goodness of how he had moved through the world. This man had just offered her a 4th. "He would have wanted to meet you," she said finally. Her voice was even. "He liked people who read him carefully enough to argue with him." "I did argue with him. In the margins." "I have the books," she said. "He kept every volume he annotated." "I was not—" He stopped. "That is not why I know," she said. "I wasn't offering them. I was telling you something about him." She looked at him directly. "He kept every book he wrote in, hundreds of them, every argument in the margins. He said the dialogue you have with a text is its own document. Alexander looked at her with the expression of a man who has reached for something familiar and found for the second time in this conversation something entirely different than he expected. He sounds, Alexander said slowly, like someone who understood that learning never stops. He believed it was the only honest response to being alive. She paused. He also believed that a man who stopped arguing with his own conclusions was a man who had already decided not to grow. She held his gaze. I think that's what you were doing. In the margins. The silence between them changed. It was not the silence of two strangers politely filling an evening. It was the silence of two people who have unexpectedly arrived somewhere more important than where they began and are pausing to register that fact. Miss Whitcombe, said Lady Pemberton's voice immediately to Eleanor's left. Eleanor turned. Lady Pemberton was perhaps 45, one of the senior fixtures of London society, a woman of formidable social intelligence, and the particular smile that means something other than warmth. Beside her stood her niece, Miss Cecilia Pemberton, 18 and exquisite and clearly uncomfortable. How lovely to see you, Lady Pemberton continued, not looking at Eleanor at all, but at the Duke. Your Grace, we were afraid you might not attend this season. You have been so, a deliberate pause, private. Lady Pemberton, Alexander said. The warmth in his voice from 30 seconds ago was entirely absent. Not coldness exactly. Simply the removal of engagement. Lady Pemberton, who had not survived London society for 20 years, by missing signals caught this one and turned to Eleanor. The smile shifted into the version that women deploy on other women when they are calculating and do not particularly want to be obvious about it. Miss Whitcombe, she said. What a dear little dress. It was said very pleasantly. The word little did the work. Eleanor smiled back with perfect composure. Thank you. I find excessive jewelry makes it difficult to think clearly. She glanced at Lady Pemberton's considerable diamond arrangement with the expression of someone making a genuinely interesting academic observation. Lady Pemberton's smile froze for precisely 1 second. We must find you a dance partner, she said, recovering smoothly. Such a shame to spend the whole evening by the— Miss Whitcombe is already engaged, Alexander said. Both Eleanor and Lady Pemberton turned to look at him. For the next hour, he continued, I was hoping she would be willing to tell me more about her father's unpublished work. He looked at Eleanor. Not a performance, not a rescue, a genuine question. If you are willing. Lady Pemberton's smile remained perfectly in place, but behind it, Eleanor could see the specific recalculation of a woman updating a very large mental spreadsheet very quickly. Of course, Lady Pemberton said. She steered her niece away with the economy of someone who has learned that a tactical withdrawal is not a defeat. Eleanor looked at the Duke. I did not require assistance, she said quietly. No, he agreed. You were doing excellently on your own. The jewelry comment was, the almost smile, precise. Then why did you intervene? He considered this for a moment, with the genuine consideration he appeared to bring to everything. Because she was going to be rude to you for the next 4 minutes in ways that were plausibly deniable, and I found I did not particularly want to watch that happen. That is still a form of rescue. Is it I told her that I wanted your time? That's true. I am not certain that's rescue. He looked at her. Would you prefer I had said nothing and allowed the conversation to continue? Eleanor thought about it honestly. No, she said. But I would prefer if you do something like that again to understand that you are doing it because you wanted to, rather than because you thought I needed it. He was very still for a moment. Yes, he said. I take the distinction. Good. The music reached the end of its piece. A brief silence, then new notes beginning. The room reorganized itself around the change of tempo, with the practiced ease of people who had attended many balls and understood the rhythm of them. Tell me about the unpublished work, Alexander said. What your father was working on when he died. Eleanor looked at him. She had not discussed this with anyone outside the academic world in 4 years. The unpublished manuscript, 300 pages on the historical responsibilities of land stewardship and the ethical frameworks that legitimate inheritance, had sat in a trunk in her aunt's library since his death read by 2 university colleagues and no one else. "It is probably the best thing he ever wrote," she said. "And it may never be published." Why? Because the people who would need to fund its publication are the people its arguments make uncomfortable. She paused. "He wrote that inherited power is only legitimate when it actively serves those who cannot inherit. That a man who holds an estate in trust for his family name but neglects the families who work that land has inverted the moral logic of stewardship entirely." She looked at him steadily. "These are not arguments that wealthy landowners are generally eager to fund." He held her gaze. He did not look away. He did not qualify or deflect. "No," he said. "They are not." A pause. "They are also correct." Something settled quiet and significant in the space between them. "You have actually read him," she said. Not an accusation. Something closer to recognition. 11 times, he said again. "As I mentioned." 11 times, she repeated. "That is very specific. I remember each reading for a different reason." He paused. "The third time I was 25. I had just dismissed an estate manager who had been with the family for 20 years because he was unable to modernize his methods quickly enough. I read the chapter on loyalty and institutional memory 3 days later. I have spent the following decade attempting to correct that decision indirectly." He paused again. "I have not fully managed it." Eleanor looked at him. She was looking at him the way she looked at things that required proper attention, not searching for anything in particular, but open to whatever was actually there. She had expected at the beginning of this evening to find exactly what London said. He was cold remote, a man so armored in duty that the person inside had become inaccessible. She had not expected this. "What do you do?" she asked carefully, with the feeling of having made a decision you cannot unmake. Howe was quiet for a long moment. "I try to make decisions for the next 20 years that account for the previous 20's mistakes," he said. "It is not a satisfying answer, but it is an honest one." "No," she said. "It is not satisfying." She paused. "It is, however, the correct one. My father would have approved of it." "That matters to you, his approval. High is gone. His approval is no longer available." She looked at her hands for a brief moment, then back at him. "But his way of thinking remains. And yes, I still measure things against it. Not as authority, as compass." "That is how I use his books," Alexander said, very quietly, as though he had not quite intended to say it aloud. The ballroom continued around them, indifferent and elaborate, and Eleanor became aware that something was happening in this conversation that she had not prepared for and could not entirely name. Not attraction, or not only attraction, which was the word that applied to a feeling of simple warmth. Something more structural than that. The sense of standing in a room and finding unexpectedly that the person beside you is reading the same map. "I should find my aunt," she said. "She will be wondering where I am." "Yes," he said. He did not argue. He did not ask her to stay. He accepted it with the same directness he brought to everything else. He offered his arm to walk her back toward the main floor. She took it. It was the correct thing to do, and she was not going to refuse it on principle, and they walked together through the edge of the crowd. People noticed. She could feel them noticing. She had the specific awareness of someone accustomed to being invisible, suddenly finding herself highly visible, and it was strange, and she was not entirely sure yet what to do with it. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, when they reached the point where Aunt Harriet was sitting with 2 other matrons and watching their approach with an expression of barely contained astonishment. "Your Grace, your father's unpublished manuscript." He looked at her directly. "Would you be willing to discuss it with me further? Not tonight. At a time that is more suited for a real conversation." She looked at him. "Why?" she asked. Again. The same question she had asked at the beginning. "Because I believe it should exist in the world," he said simply. "And I may be in a position to help." "That is not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I will consider it. That is all I am asking." She stepped away, moved toward her aunt. She heard Aunt Harriet say something in a low, urgent, completely overwhelmed voice that she chose to temporarily not process. She was thinking about what he had said. "I came tonight searching for someone I believed no longer existed." She had not asked him to explain that sentence. She had not asked him to complete it. She had filed it in the place where she kept things that required more time and more information before she could understand them properly. She looked back once across the room. He was still standing where she had left him, not watching her exactly, simply present in the room he had crossed in the space where the most unexpected conversation of his season had just happened. He looked, she thought, like a man who had found something he had not known he was searching for and was not yet certain what to do with that discovery. She turned away. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady, but underneath the steadiness, something she had not expected and did not have a name for. Yet something had shifted, small and significant, and impossible to pretend was nothing. Like a page she had not known was missing suddenly found. She was not going to be careless with it. Aunt Harriet waited until they were in the carriage. Then, "Alexander Hawthorne spoke to you for 45 minutes. "Yes." "He walked past every eligible woman in that room." "Yes." "Eleanor." Aunt Harriet's voice had reached the frequency it achieved when she was very close to saying something important and could not quite decide how. "Do you understand what just happened?" "He wanted to tell me something about my father's work," Eleanor said. "Which he did." "No." Aunt Harriet stopped. "Your father's work." "Yes, he has read it extensively. He had specific things to say about it." She looked out the window at the dark city moving past. "It was a good conversation." "It was 45 minutes, Aunt Harriet said again, as though repetition would make the information more manageable. "Yes, he is not a man who wastes time on conversations that don't merit it." She paused. "Which is actually one of the more interesting things I learned about him tonight." Aunt Harriet sat back against the seat cushions with the expression of someone who has arrived at a situation considerably more complex than anticipated and is beginning to understand that the complexity is going to continue. "And?" she said finally. Eleanor looked at her. "And what did you think of him?" Eleanor considered this honestly, in the way she considered everything, not reaching for the answer she was expected to give, but looking at what was actually there. "I think," she said carefully, "that he is a great deal more than London believes him to be." She paused. "And I think he knows that no one is looking closely enough to find it." Another pause. "And I think that troubles him in ways he has learned to make invisible." Aunt Harriet stared at her. "He asked to speak with me again," Eleanor said. "About the manuscript." "About the—" Aunt Harriet's voice had gone entirely faint. "Eleanor, I told him I would consider it. You told the Duke of Wexford you would consider his invitation. I told him I would consider the question of whether to discuss a scholarly matter with him." Eleanor said precisely. "Which I will. Consider it." She looked out the window again. "He is either exactly who I think he is, in which case the conversation will be valuable, or he is not, in which case I will know that, and it will also be useful information." She felt Aunt Harriet looking at her with the specific mixture of exasperation and affection that was her particular form of love, and she did not respond to it, and she continued watching London pass outside the window. She was thinking about a man who had read her father's work 11 times and remembered which reading and why. She was thinking about margins full of arguments. She was thinking about what it meant that he had crossed a room full of spectacular women to speak to the one who was having the interesting conversation by the library doors. Not because of how she looked, not because of her name, or her prospects, or the social calculation of it, but because cartography was a notable deviation. She was thinking about a sentence she had not yet asked him to complete. "I came tonight searching for someone I believed no longer existed." She folded her hands in her lap. She was going to think about this carefully, with patience, without rushing toward conclusions she had not yet earned. Her father had taught her that. The most important information in a document, he had always said, is not always what is immediately visible. It is what you find when you look long enough and carefully enough to see past the surface to the structure beneath. She intended to look carefully. She intended to look very carefully indeed. The carriage moved through the London night, And Eleanor Whitcombe sat in the dark and thought about a duke who was exhausted and lonely, and had read her father 11 times, and had walked the full length of the most important ballroom of the season to stop in front of a woman in a simple ivory dress, and had called it without drama, without performance, simply searching. 3 days passed before Eleanor made her decision. She spent those 3 days doing exactly what she had told herself she would do, thinking carefully without rushing, without allowing the unusual quality of that ballroom conversation to distort her judgment. She reread 2 chapters of her father's 3rd volume. She took long walks with Aunt Harriet in the morning, and gave monosyllabic responses to questions about the Duke, which Aunt Harriet accepted with the patience of a woman who had learned that pressing Eleanor produced silence rather than information. She organized her father's correspondence files, which she had been meaning to do for months, and she found in that task a kind of steadying the familiar handwriting, the careful reasoning, the evidence of a mind that had moved through the world with honesty and precision, and had expected the same from everyone it encountered. On the 4th morning she wrote a letter. It was brief. She told the Duke that she was willing to discuss the manuscript, that she would be available at her aunt's house on Thursday afternoon, and that she would ask her aunt to be present for the meeting, which was both the correct social arrangement and her own preference, since she was not yet ready to conduct this conversation in private. She sealed it. She sent it. She told herself this was a practical decision about a scholarly matter. She was not entirely sure she believed herself. His response arrived within 2 hours, which was faster than any letter had any business arriving, which told her something about the organization of his household. And also she suspected something about how the letter had been handled at the receiving end. He wrote that Thursday was acceptable. He wrote that Lady Harriet's presence was entirely appropriate. He wrote in the final line without preamble or explanation, "I have been looking forward to this conversation since Tuesday." Eleanor read that line twice. Then she put the letter in the small box where she kept things she intended to return to. She told herself it was simply polite correspondence. She was less convincing this time. Thursday arrived with the particular quality that important days sometimes had, ordinary in every surface detail, different underneath. The morning went as mornings went. Tea. Letters. Aunt Harriet asking twice what time the Duke was expected, and then pretending she had not asked. The sitting room was made presentable in the way that rooms are made presentable when someone important is coming, and the household wants to seem like they haven't put in any effort while having put in considerable effort. He arrived exactly at 2 o'clock. This, Eleanor noted, was itself information. A man who arrived exactly when he said he would was a man who kept the commitments he made, who did not treat other people's time as less valuable than his own. She had known people her whole life who arrived late as a form of demonstration of their busyness, their importance, their abundant demands. She had always found it tedious. Aunt Harriet received him in the sitting room with the precise, careful warmth of a woman who was simultaneously thrilled and determined not to appear thrilled. Alexander Hawthorne accepted her welcome with a courtesy that was neither stiff nor performed. He inquired about her health. He thanked her for the hospitality. He sat down when invited, and he turned to Eleanor and he said, "I have thought about what you told me at the ball, about the manuscript. I would like to understand more about what prevented it from being published." No preamble. No social circling. Directly to the thing that mattered. Eleanor found herself appreciating this more than she had expected. She told him. Not everything, not all at once, but the shape of it. How her father had completed the manuscript 8 months before his illness became serious. How he had submitted the first 3 chapters to 2 major publishers. How both had declined with the kind of careful language that makes refusal sound like a compliment. How a 3rd publisher, smaller and more idealistic, had expressed interest, and then 6 weeks later had quietly withdrawn it after a conversation with Lord Belmont, whose family held the land stewardship practices her father had criticized most specifically in Chapter 7. Alexander listened without interrupting. His attention was complete the way she had noticed his attention tended to be not the performance of listening, but the actual thing, the quality of someone who was genuinely receiving what was being said. "Belmont," he said when she finished. "Yes, Belmont and I," he said carefully, "have a complex history." He paused. He sits on two boards that affect policy in areas where I have significant interest. We are not enemies. We are also not aligned. Is that relevant? It may be. He looked at her directly. I want to be transparent with you. If I become involved in the manuscript's publication, Belmont will know, and he will not be pleased. I want you to understand that before you decide whether my involvement is something you want. Eleanor looked at him. This was the moment she understood it clearly, where she was supposed to be impressed by the sacrifice he was implying, and soften accordingly. She was aware of the structure of it. She was also aware underneath the awareness that the offer was genuine. Why would you involve yourself at all? She asked. Because the work is important. He said it simply. And because important work that disappears because a powerful man found it inconvenient is a particular kind of injustice that I have always found. He paused, intolerable. That is a strong word. I use it deliberately. Aunt Harriet made a small sound from the corner of the room that Eleanor chose to attribute to the tea. If I were to agree to your involvement, Eleanor said, what would that look like practically? I know 3 publishers outside Belmont's sphere of influence. I would need to read the full manuscript first to speak about it credibly, to advocate for it from a position of genuine knowledge rather than patronage. He met her eyes. I would not speak about it without having read it. That would be dishonest. You would read all 300 pages. Yes. It is dense. Academically dense. The argument in Chapter 9 alone. I have read your father's published work 11 times, he said. I am not afraid of Chapter 9. For the moment she almost smiled. She stopped it just short of visible. I will think about it, she said. I expected that, he said. Take whatever time you need. They spoke for another hour. About the manuscript, then beyond it, about her father's method of research, the way he had approached primary sources, his habit of building an argument from the ground up, rather than finding evidence to support a conclusion already reached. She found herself talking more than she had intended, drawn out by the quality of his questions, which were specific and intelligent, and occasionally challenging, in ways that required her to think rather than simply report. At a certain point, she said something about her father's approach to land records, and Alexander said quietly, he wrote about that in the margin of page 212. In the 3rd volume. He wrote that the document is always more honest than the man who created it, because a document does not remember how to be strategic. Eleanor stopped. You know the margin notes, she said. I bought the annotated edition. He paused. I didn't realize until you mentioned them at the ball that the annotations were his own. You thought they were the editor's notes? Yes. Something shifted in his expression. Knowing they are his changes everything about them actually. They read differently. He paused. More personally. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. I was arguing with himself, she said. In the margins. He always did that. He said you couldn't trust your own conclusions unless you'd tried seriously to break them. Yes, Alexander said. I know. A pause. I have tried to apply that practice to my own thinking. I have found it uncomfortable and extremely useful. Aunt Harriet set down her teacup with a small sound that was definitively not about the tea. When Alexander left at precisely 4 o'clock, he paused at the door and looked back at Eleanor with the expression she had begun to recognize, the direct, unguarded attention that he brought to things that actually mattered to him. Thank you, he said, for allowing this conversation. Thank you for asking for it, she said. He nodded once. Then he was gone. Aunt Harriet waited approximately 10 seconds. Eleanor, she said. I know, Eleanor said. He read the margin notes. I know. He thought they were editorial annotations, and he read them anyway 11 times and found them. Harriet. Aunt Harriet pressed her lips together. Then, he is not what anyone says he is. No, Eleanor agreed. He is not. She picked up the tea things. She carried them to the kitchen. She stood in the kitchen for a moment alone with the particular quality of a person who is holding something carefully, because they are afraid that if they hold it wrong, it will break. She was not going to be careless with this. She had promised herself. The visits continued. Not every week that would have been conspicuous in a way that Eleanor had no interest in inviting, but regularly, with the quiet consistency of something that had established its own rhythm. He came on Thursdays. Sometimes he brought a question he had been thinking about since the previous week. Sometimes she had a question waiting for him. Aunt Harriet was always present, always discreet, occasionally and deliberately requiring something from another room for 10 minutes at a time in a way that was neither subtle nor intended to be. The manuscript remained in its trunk. Eleanor had not yet given him access to it. She knew why she had examined the reason with the same honesty she applied to everything. And the reason was this: the manuscript was the last substantial thing her father had made. Giving someone access to it was a form of trust that she was not yet ready to extend to anyone, regardless of how the conversations on Thursday afternoons were going. She was watching instead, listening, building an understanding that was not based on the quality of his attention during pleasant conversations, but on smaller, harder things, how he spoke about his tenants, what he said when the news from Parliament was unfavorable and affected his position, whether he ever took an easy position when a harder one was more accurate. The answer consistently was no. He did not take easy positions. He did not tell her things she would enjoy hearing. When she said something he thought was incorrect, he said so directly and without apology, and then he explained his reasoning. She pushed back. He considered her pushback. Sometimes he revised. Sometimes he held his position. He was always honest about which he was doing and why. It was the most intellectually engaging relationship of her adult life. She was also beginning to understand that it was becoming something else, which was more complicated and which she was managing by not looking at it directly. The first sign that something had changed came not from him, but from London. It was Lady Pemberton, who delivered it at a morning call that Aunt Harriet accepted before Eleanor could strategically arrange to be elsewhere. Lady Pemberton arrived with Miss Cecilia Pemberton and 2 cups of social intention disguised as concern, and she said within 4 minutes of sitting down that she had heard, merely heard, she was not spreading anything, that Miss Whitcombe had been receiving visits from a certain gentleman, and that the county was naturally curious, and that several families had been wondering whether there was a formal arrangement in prospect. "There is no formal arrangement," Eleanor said. "Of course not," Lady Pemberton said in the tone that means of course not yet. "Only one does hear things, and one does wonder." She paused to arrange her expression into something resembling genuine concern. "Whether Miss Whitcombe fully understands the expectations that attend a man of his Grace's position. The kind of woman his family would consider appropriate. I imagine they would want someone intelligent and honest," Eleanor said pleasantly. "As most families do." "They would want a woman of appropriate standing," Lady Pemberton said, dropping pleasant entirely. "Connections, wealth, social influence, a family whose name adds to the duchy rather than," she paused, "complicates it." The room was very quiet for a moment. Aunt Harriet was looking at Lady Pemberton with an expression Eleanor had seen approximately 4 times in her life, the expression that Aunt Harriet produced when someone said something she found genuinely unacceptable and was deciding between polite erasure and full response. Eleanor got there first. "Lady Pemberton," she said, "I appreciate your concern. I will tell you plainly that the conversations I have been having are about my father's scholarly work, which the Duke has a genuine interest in. If the county finds that interesting, it is welcome to. If you find it threatening, that is a separate and more revealing issue." Lady Pemberton's expression went through 3 stages in approximately 2 seconds: offense recalibration, and a return to pleasantness that was now notably less warm. "I simply meant to be helpful," she said. "I know," Eleanor said, "and I have been." Lady Pemberton left 17 minutes earlier than the minimum required by social courtesy. Aunt Harriet waited until the door closed. "That," she said, "was masterful." "It was necessary," Eleanor said. She was already thinking about something else, something that Lady Pemberton had said, not the insult, but the thing behind it. The kind of woman his family would consider appropriate. She had not thought about his family. Not seriously. Not as something that would become relevant. She was thinking about it now. She was thinking about it the following Thursday, when Alexander arrived at 2 o'clock, and she said almost before he had sat down, "Tell me about your family's expectations for your marriage." He went very still. "That is a direct question," he said. "Yes." "May I ask what prompted it?" "Lady Pemberton came to call," Eleanor said. She had concerns she wanted to share. Something moved through his expression, not quite anger, but its neighbor. "What concerns?" "The usual ones: standing, connections, appropriate matches." She looked at him evenly. "She implied that a woman like me would complicate rather than improve your position." "Lady Pemberton," he said, "has been attempting to position her niece as my future Duchess for 3 seasons. Her concerns should be evaluated in that light." "I have evaluated them in that light. They still contain a real question." Eleanor held his gaze. "What do your family expect?" He was quiet for a long moment. Not the quiet of avoidance, the quiet of honest assembly. "My mother," he said finally, "has a list. She compiled it approximately 5 years ago and updates it annually. The criteria are sufficient wealth to maintain the estate independently. Bloodlines that carry social weight in both London and the northern counties, and her primary concern, no family history that would invite scrutiny. And a historian's daughter who lost her fortune because her father refused to participate in political corruption," Eleanor said. "Would not appear on the list," he said, quietly, directly. "No." Aunt Harriet had stopped pretending to read. Eleanor breathed. "Then I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." "Always." "When you walked across the Hartwell ballroom," she said, "was it partly because I was safe? Because a woman without standing, without wealth, without social weight, a woman who would not be taken seriously as a prospect, was the only kind of woman you could approach without the entire county reading it as a declaration?" The silence that followed was long enough to mean something. "Yes," he said. Aunt Harriet made a sound. "Partly," he said. He did not look away. He did not qualify or retreat. "In the beginning, before I spoke to you, there was something of that. I could approach you. I could have a conversation, without it becoming," he paused, "a negotiation." Eleanor sat with this. It was not what she had wanted the answer to be. She was honest enough with herself to know that. She had wanted him to say no. It was only your father's work, only the intelligence, only the conversation. She had wanted the clean version. He had given her the true one. "And now," she said. "Now," he said carefully, "it is considerably more complicated than safe." Their eyes held for a long moment. "I see," she said. "I am not apologizing for the beginning," he said. "I am telling you the truth about it because you asked, and because you deserve the truth. But I am asking you to also hear what I am telling you about now." "I heard it," she said. "Eleanor, I need to think," she said. Not cold, not closed, but honest, the same honesty she demanded from him applied without exception to herself. "You have told me something that changes how I understand the last several weeks. I am going to need to think about what it means." He nodded. He understood. She could see that he understood, not just accepted, but genuinely understood, the way someone understands when they have been given the same quality of honesty they offered. "Thursday," he said, standing. "Thursday," she agreed. He left. She sat in the sitting room with Aunt Harriet's completely silent presence beside her, and thought about the difference between being safe and being chosen, and whether in the beginning those things were necessarily incompatible. She thought about her father's margins, about a man who argued with his own conclusions because he could not trust them otherwise. She thought about the fact that Alexander had told her the truth when the comfortable answer was right there and would have served him better. She thought about that for a long time. The following Tuesday, 4 days before the next Thursday, she sent the trunk. She didn't send a letter with it. She sent the trunk itself, carefully packed the manuscript pages, interleaved with protective paper, the way she would have packed anything that mattered, with a note that contained exactly one line. "I think you will read it honestly. That is enough." His response arrived the next morning. Not a letter. A single sheet of his personal stationery, the handwriting slightly less controlled than his usual correspondence, as though it had been written quickly before he could think too carefully about the words. "I will. I already have been since last night." Chapter 3 is extraordinary. Your father understood something about the nature of obligation that most men spend their entire lives avoiding. I will write more when I have finished. Thank you for trusting me with this. Eleanor read it standing at the hallway table where Thomas had left it. She read it again. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the small box. The box that was getting full. What she did not know, could not have known, was that 2 days after she sent the trunk while Alexander was deep in Chapter 7, a visitor arrived at Wexford House, Lady Catherine Belmont, 23 years old, the daughter of the Earl of Salcombe. Precisely the kind of woman who appeared on Alexander's mother's list at the top of it, in fact, underlined twice in the most recent update. Lady Catherine arrived with her mother and a very particular kind of social intention that did not announce itself as such. She arrived with warmth and elegance and a family history that interlocked neatly with the Hawthorne dukedom. She arrived most precisely because the Dowager Duchess of Wexford had invited her, had arranged the visit with the careful efficiency of a woman who had observed her son's unusual attention toward an unsuitable direction, and had decided that the correct response was not confrontation, but redirection. Alexander received them correctly. He was courteous. He was present. He gave them an hour of his afternoon. His mother watched him throughout that hour, with the particular attention of a woman performing an assessment, and at the end of it, when the Belmonts had gone, and the sitting room was quiet, she looked at her son and said, "She is everything the family needs." Alexander looked at his mother. "Yes," he said, "she is." His mother heard something in the word that made her set down her teacup. "Alexander," she said. "Lady Belmont is accomplished, well-connected, and entirely appropriate," he said. "I am aware of all of that." "But," his mother said. I was quiet for a moment. Then, "There is no but. Not one I am prepared to give you today." His mother looked at him with the expression of a woman who understood her son very well, and was not entirely pleased by what she understood. "The Whitcombe woman," she said. "Has a name," he said. Quiet but clear. "Alexander." His mother's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I am asking you to be practical. This family has responsibilities. You have responsibilities. A historian's daughter with a failed estate, and a father whose published work made enemies in half the peerage. Made honest enemies," he said, "by telling the truth about them, is not a suitable future for this duchy." She looked at him steadily. "I am not asking you to stop speaking to her. I am asking you to be clear-eyed about what is and is not possible." He looked at his mother. He thought about Chapter 7 of a manuscript he had read half of in 2 days. He thought about a woman who had told him without apology that she needed to think, and had then sent the most important thing she possessed as an answer. "I am being clear-eyed," he said quietly. "I promise you I am." His mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she said with the specific precision of a woman delivering a message that is also a warning, "Lady Belmont's family has indicated they would look favorably upon a formal approach before the end of the season. That window will not remain open indefinitely." She left the room. Alexander sat alone with Chapter 7 of William Whitcombe's unpublished manuscript, and he read, and he thought, and he sat with the particular weight of a man standing at the exact point where the life he was supposed to live, and the life he was beginning to want, looked at each other directly. He did not pick up his pen that evening to write to Eleanor. He needed to think first. To be honest with himself the way she was always honest with herself. To not tell her something until he was certain it was the true thing, because she would know the difference, and she deserved better than words assembled before he understood what they meant. He read until midnight. Then he sat with the closed manuscript in the quiet of his study, and he thought about what it cost a man to tell the truth when the comfortable answer was right there. I thought his mother was not wrong about the facts. He thought the facts were not the whole of the truth. He had learned that from page 212 of a book he had read 11 times. In the margin in handwriting he now knew was the author's own "A document does not remember how to be strategic. That is why we trust it." He opened the trunk again. He began Chapter 8. He finished the manuscript on a Friday. Eleanor knew this because he appeared at her aunt's door on a Friday afternoon without a prior arrangement, which he had never done, and when Thomas showed him into the sitting room, she looked up from her desk and saw immediately that something had changed in him. Not distress. Not the careful management of feeling that she had learned to recognize as his default. Something rawer than that. Something that had been moved. "You finished it," she said. "Last night." He sat down without being asked. He set the manuscript, carefully repacked each page in its protective interleaving on the table between them. He put his hands on either side of it as though it were something he needed to anchor. "Eleanor, this work cannot stay in a trunk." "I know that." He knew it would make enemies. He wrote it anyway. "Yes." Chapter 11. His voice was not quite controlled. She had never heard him not quite controlled before. The section on the moral fiction of inherited right as a substitute for earned responsibility. He names the specific argument, not the specific people, but the argument that every generation of titled families tells itself to avoid examining its own conduct, and then he dismantles it, completely, without anger, just evidence and logic and clarity. "He spent 3 years on that chapter," Eleanor said quietly. "He rewrote it 7 times. How did it never get published?" It wasn't a question. The shape of his voice made it something between grief and fury. "I told you. Belmont has been managing his reputation through other people's silence for 15 years, Alexander said. "I know exactly how he operates because I have watched him operate. I have sat across from him in Parliament and listened to him apply pressure in rooms where pressure is not supposed to be visible, and I have—" He stopped. "I have not done enough about it." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "You are doing something now. I am reading a manuscript and wanting to do something now," he said. "That is not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She paused. "What would doing something look like practically?" He looked at her. The expression on his face was the one she had come to think of as his most honest one, the one that appeared when he was thinking about something real, rather than managing how he appeared to be thinking. "There is a publisher," he said. "Alistair Pemberton, not Lady Pemberton's family, different entirely. He operates out of Edinburgh. He has published 3 works that Belmont found uncomfortable, and he did not retract any of them. He is principled, and he is not beholden to the London social network in the ways that make London publishers vulnerable to that kind of pressure." He paused. "I have a relationship with him, a professional one. I helped finance one of his scholarly series 4 years ago. He would take my introduction seriously, and Belmont would know within a week, would not be pleased." He held her gaze. "I told you this was a possibility at the beginning. I am telling you now that it is more than a possibility. I am telling you that if you want this, I am ready to pursue it, and I am asking you to understand what that means for both of us before you decide." Something tightened in Eleanor's chest. She managed it. "What does it mean for you?" "It means a public declaration of where I stand relative to Belmont's political interests, which have until now been in an uneasy alignment with mine on certain land policy questions." He paused. "It means losing that alignment and the legislative convenience that comes with it." "That is significant." "Yes. And for me," Howe was quiet for a moment. "Belmont will look for ways to characterize your father's work as politically motivated rather than scholarly. He will attempt to associate it, and by extension you, with a specific reform agenda that some members of the peerage find threatening. He will not do it directly. He will do it through intermediaries, through social channels, through the kind of whisper campaign that is very effective and very difficult to counter." He met her eyes. "I want you to know that before we proceed, not after." Eleanor breathed. She thought about her father. She thought about 7 drafts of Chapter 11. She thought about a man who had known his work would make enemies and had written it exactly as honestly as he knew how. "When do we contact Pemberton?" she said. Something settled in Alexander's face. Not relief. It was not quite relief. Something that looked like being seen. "I will write to him today," he said. "Good." Aunt Harriet appeared in the doorway with tea, looked at the two of them, assessed the situation with the accuracy of a woman who had been paying attention for several months, and set the tray down without a word. The letter to Pemberton went out that evening. What came back 11 days later was not from Pemberton. It was from the Dowager Duchess of Wexford. It arrived addressed to Aunt Harriet, which was itself a choice. A deliberate social positioning that said, "I am communicating with your household, not with your niece, because your niece does not yet have a formal status that would make her a direct recipient." The letter was elegant and brief, and said essentially that the Dowager Duchess was in London for the season, and would appreciate the opportunity to call at Eleanor's aunt's convenience to make the acquaintance of Miss Whitcombe, of whom she had heard the phrase was precisely chosen a great deal. Aunt Harriet read it aloud to Eleanor at breakfast. Eleanor set down her toast. "What does she know?" she said. "Everything, I imagine," Aunt Harriet said. "These women always know everything. Alexander told her about the manuscript. Or she found out through other means. She would have other means." Aunt Harriet folded the letter carefully. "The question is what she wants from calling on us." Eleanor thought about this. She thought about the mother who kept a list. The list with the criteria that Eleanor did not meet. She thought about the Belmont visit that Alexander had told her about, not immediately, but eventually 3 weeks after it had happened, with the slightly complicated expression of a man who had waited too long and knew it. That conversation had been on a Tuesday evening. He had told her that his mother had arranged the visit. He had told her that Lady Catherine Belmont was exactly what his family expected. He had told her that he had been polite and present, and had not made any commitments. And Eleanor had listened to all of it with the careful composure of a woman performing calm she did not entirely feel. "You told her about the manuscript," Eleanor had said. "I didn't tell her anything. She drew her own conclusions from the Pemberton correspondence." "Your mother reads your correspondence." "My mother receives a great deal of information about my affairs through channels that I have never fully mapped." He'd said it with the dryness of someone who had made peace with a situation he could not change. "I have stopped attempting to prevent it. I simply try to ensure that the information she receives is accurate." "And is it accurate what she knows?" He'd looked at her for a long moment. "That I have been spending time with you. That I have read your father's manuscript. That I intend to help publish it. That I have introduced you to nothing and made no formal arrangement." He'd paused. "She believes, and she is not wrong, that I have developed feelings that I have not yet acted on." "Yet," Eleanor said. "Yet," he agreed, quietly, without breaking her gaze. She had held the word the same way she held everything that mattered carefully, in a place where it wouldn't break, returning to it over and over until she understood its full shape. Now she sat with her aunt's letter from the Dowager Duchess, and felt the careful balance of everything she had been building tilt very slightly. "I will receive her," she said. "Eleanor, I will receive her," she said again. "She is his mother, and she is coming to understand what kind of person I am. I would rather she understand it from me directly than from whatever version of me she has assembled from second-hand accounts." Aunt Harriet looked at her with the expression she wore when Eleanor did something she found both alarming and completely characteristic. "Very well," she said. The Dowager Duchess arrived on the following Thursday. She was 61 years old, and she carried herself with the specific authority of a woman who had never in her adult life been required to apologize for taking up space. She was not unkind in her manner. Eleanor noted this carefully, but she was precise in a way that left no room for comfortable vagueness. She sat down, she accepted tea, and then she looked at Eleanor with the direct, assessing attention of someone who had decided that social pleasantries were not going to accomplish what she needed to accomplish. "Miss Whitcombe," she said, "my son speaks of you frequently." "I am glad our conversations have been worth mentioning," Eleanor said. "He speaks of your father's work primarily, and of your intelligence, and of your honesty, which he appears to consider somewhat remarkable." A brief pause. "He has never described a woman's honesty as remarkable before." "I cannot speak to that," Eleanor said. "No." The Dowager Duchess studied her. "I can. He has not." She set down her teacup with the precision of someone making a point. "Miss Whitcombe, I am going to speak to you plainly because I believe you would prefer that, and because I find I respect you enough to attempt it." "Please," Eleanor said. "My son is 36 years old. He has been the Duke of Wexford for 14 years. He carries the responsibility of an estate that employs 400 people, influences the livelihoods of twice that number of tenant families, and holds obligations that do not pause for personal preference. She held Eleanor's gaze. He needs a wife who strengthens his position, not because I am cold or because I do not care what he feels, but because the consequences of a weakened position are not his alone to bear. They fall on every person attached to that estate. Eleanor was very still. I understand that, she said. Do you? My father spent 30 years studying the history of estates like your son's, Eleanor said quietly. I grew up understanding that a title is not a personal possession. It is a responsibility. My father wrote extensively, as your son has evidently told you, about the moral weight of that responsibility. She paused. I have never for a moment imagined that the Duke's situation is simple, or that what he chooses costs only him. The Dowager Duchess looked at her. Then you understand, she said, why I am asking you to think carefully about what you are to each other. I think carefully about everything, Eleanor said. Yes. The older woman's voice shifted just slightly, not softer but less armored. I believe you do. She was quiet for a moment. My son has carried this family's responsibilities since he was 22 years old. He has never once, not once, put his own happiness above his duty. I respect him enormously for it. I have also watched it cost him more than most people know. She paused. If you care about him, and I believe from everything I have observed that you do, then I am asking you to consider whether what you are building together can sustain what comes with his name. Not whether you are worthy of him. That is not the question. The question is whether you are both ready for what being together actually means. Eleanor held the Dowager Duchess's gaze for a long moment. That, she said finally, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me about this situation. Something moved across the older woman's face. Not warmth exactly, the acknowledgement that warmth was possible. I am not your enemy, Miss Whitcombe, she said. I know, Eleanor said. You are his mother, and you love him, and you are frightened that what he feels will lead him somewhere that costs him things you cannot afford to watch him lose. She paused. I understand that fear. Aunt Harriet in the corner was utterly silent. The Dowager Duchess looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Lady Catherine Belmont, she said, has indicated through her family that she would receive a formal approach favorably. I know, Eleanor said. You know, your son told me. She met the older woman's eyes steadily. He tells me things he finds difficult to tell me. That is one of the qualities I value most about him. The Dowager Duchess stood. She adjusted her gloves. She looked at Eleanor one more time, the full comprehensive look of a woman filing a complete assessment. I hope you will continue to think carefully, she said. I always do, Eleanor replied. When she left, Aunt Harriet exhaled very slowly. That was remarkable, she said. She loves him, Eleanor said. She was already thinking about something else. And she is not wrong about any of the facts. Eleanor stood. The facts are not the whole of the truth, but they are real. She moved toward the door. I need to think. She did not see Alexander that week. She sent a brief note explaining that she was unwell, which was not untrue in the ways that mattered. She was not physically unwell. She was in the condition of a person who has been handed a great deal of true information and needs time to examine it honestly. She thought about what it meant to choose this man. Not the feeling of it, she was past the stage where she could pretend the feeling wasn't real. She thought about what it actually required. She thought about the estate, and the tenants, and the legislative responsibilities, and the social weight of a duchy. She thought about the Dowager Duchess's list, and the Belmont family, and Lady Catherine, who was everything the list required. She thought about whether she was someone who walked toward difficult things or away from them. She had her answer by the third day. She sent a second note Thursday as usual. I have something to tell you. He arrived at 2 o'clock. He sat down. He looked at her. He did not perform patience. He simply waited with the quality of someone who has learned that waiting honestly is more useful than filling silence. Your mother came to see me, she said. I know. His jaw tightened slightly. I asked her not to. She didn't listen. She rarely does when she believes she is right. He held her gaze. I am sorry, Eleanor. She had no right to. She had every right, Eleanor said. She is your mother, and she is worried about you, and she said things that were honest and accurate, and that I needed to hear. He was quiet. She told me nothing I hadn't already considered, Eleanor continued. She simply said it directly, which I respected. She paused. She also asked me to think carefully, which I did. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his most unguarded, the one without armor. And, he said, I need to ask you something first. Anything. Lady Catherine Belmont, Eleanor said. Is she someone you could marry? Not someone your family wants you to marry. You specifically, is she someone you could build a life with and find it not just tolerable, but genuinely good? The silence was long. She is accomplished, he said carefully. She is kind. She would manage the social responsibilities of the position with considerable skill. That is not what I asked. No. He looked at his hands. It is not. He was quiet for another moment. The honest answer is that I could marry her, and it would be correct in every way that a marriage can be correct, and I would spend the rest of my life wondering what the other version of my life would have been. Eleanor breathed. I need you to understand something, she said. I am not going to allow you to choose me at the cost of everything you are responsible for. If the choice is genuinely between your happiness and the welfare of 400 people and their families, then that is not actually a choice I can support you making in my favor. He looked up sharply. But, she said. He waited. I do not believe that is the actual choice. I think your mother has framed it that way because she is frightened, and because the framing serves the conclusion she wants you to reach. I think a man of your intelligence and capability, and Alexander, you have been running this estate for 14 years. You have navigated parliamentary politics and tenant crises and family obligations that would have broken someone less. You are not a man who needs a specific kind of wife to keep his world functioning. She held his gaze. You are a man who has never once let himself ask what he actually wants. His voice, when it came, was very quiet. Eleanor, I am not asking you to choose me, she said. I am asking you to be honest about what you want. Completely honest. Not what your family needs, not what the list requires, what you actually want. And then make that choice with your eyes open. He stood up. She had not expected this. He crossed the sitting room in 3 steps, and he was standing 2 feet from her and looking at her with the fullest expression she had ever seen on his face. Not the almost smile, not the managed composure, not the careful distance. Something wide open. Something that had been building for months behind every controlled and deliberate thing he had ever said in her presence. You, he said. I want you. Not because you are safe, and not because your father changed my life, though he did. Because you are the only person I have ever spoken to who tells me the truth without deciding in advance what my response should be. Because you look at me and see... He stopped. He started differently. You see the man I am trying to be. Not the one I have performed for 20 years. The real one. The one who argues with himself in the margins because he doesn't trust his own conclusions. He paused. That man has wanted to say this for 3 months. Aunt Harriet was in the room. They both knew this. Eleanor chose not to look at her. Alexander, she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not quite, but she managed them. There are still real obstacles, yes. Your mother's concerns are legitimate. Yes. Belmont will move against the manuscript publication. That will create it will be difficult. For both of us. Yes, he said for the 3rd time. I know all of that. I have thought about all of that. I have thought about nothing else for 3 months. He met her eyes. I am still standing here. She looked at him. She thought about a woman who had survived 27 years by measuring herself against everyone else's requirements. She thought about the small box that was full now. She thought about her father's margin notes and what it meant that this man had read them 11 times and come looking for the person who might understand them. She thought about what her father had written in the very last pages of the unpublished manuscript in the final chapter that she had not discussed with Alexander yet. He had written, "The truest measure of a man is not what he inherits, but what he chooses to protect, when protecting it costs him something real." She had been waiting. She understood now to find out if Alexander Hawthorne was that man. She was looking at her answer. "There are things we need to resolve," she said. "Formally, practically. We cannot," she paused, "we cannot make personal decisions in advance of those resolutions." "No," he agreed. "We cannot." "But," he waited. "I am not going anywhere," she said. He breathed a slow, complete breath. The breath of someone releasing something they have been holding for a very long time. And then from outside the sitting room, from the direction of the front door, they heard Thomas's voice, and another voice responding, and the specific quality of a household, receiving an unexpected guest. And Aunt Harriet crossed quickly to the door, and opened it, and spoke quietly with Thomas in the hallway. She came back. Her expression was the one she wore when she had received very bad news, and was deciding how quickly to deliver it. "There is a gentleman at the door," she said. "Lord Belmont's man of business. He has brought a letter. He says it requires an immediate response." Alexander turned. "For whom?" he said. Aunt Harriet's eyes moved to Eleanor. "For Miss Whitcombe," she said, specifically. The letter was short. Lord Belmont's solicitors writing on his behalf wished to inform Miss Eleanor Whitcombe that certain documents pertaining to her father's professional conduct documents related to a financial dispute with the Pemberton family some years prior had come into Lord Belmont's possession, and that their contents, if made public, might significantly complicate both the planned publication of Professor Whitcomb's manuscript and Miss Whitcomb's personal standing in society. Lord Belmont was not, the letter stressed, making any threats. He was merely hoping that Miss Whitcombe, as an intelligent woman, would wish to be informed of the situation before proceeding further with plans that might inadvertently, of course, cause difficulty for all parties involved. Eleanor read it once. She looked up at Alexander. His face had gone very still in the way it went still when he was managing something cold and large. "There was no financial dispute," she said. "My father had no connection to the Pemberton publishing family. He had nothing to do with them." "I know," he said quietly. "These documents don't exist." "They don't need to exist," he said. He said, "to cause exactly the damage he's describing." He took a breath. She could see him calculating the fast, precise movement of a mind working through implications. "He found out about Pemberton faster than I expected." "Someone told him." "Yes." A pause. "I need to find out who." Another pause, shorter. "Eleanor, I need you to hear me. This changes nothing about what I said 20 minutes ago. But it does change what needs to happen next, and how quickly." She looked at him. "What needs to happen next?" He met her eyes. "I need to go to Belmont directly, before he moves further, before this becomes something harder to contain." "You said confronting him would cost you the legislative alignment." "Yes." His voice was level. "It will." She looked at him for a long moment. "Go," she said. He nodded. He turned to leave. At the doorway he paused. "I meant what I said," he told her without turning around. Every word of it. Then he was gone, and Eleanor stood in the sitting room with Belmont's letter in her hand and Aunt Harriet's careful silence beside her, and she thought about documents that did not exist, and men who used them like weapons, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. Not fear. Anger. Clean and specific and entirely her own. The kind of anger that comes from understanding exactly what someone has done and finding it completely unacceptable. She set the letter down on the table. "Harriet," she said. "Yes. I am going to need to look at my father's correspondence files. All of them." "Eleanor, if Belmont is going to fabricate documents about my father's conduct, I want to know exactly what my father's actual conduct was in every financial matter for the past 30 years. She looked at her aunt steadily. Because if there is any truth he can distort, any genuine complexity he can weaponize, I want to find it before he does." Aunt Harriet looked at her for a long moment. "The files," she said, "are in the library. Third shelf from the left." She stood up. "I'll get them." Eleanor sat down at the desk. She was not going to wait to find out what Belmont had. She was not going to sit quietly while someone constructed a threat out of her father's name. She was not going to allow the most honest man she had ever known to be used as a weapon against his own daughter. She reached for the first file. She began to read. Eleanor worked through the night. She pulled every file her father had kept. Correspondence, financial records, professional contracts, letters from publishers and universities and private clients, stretching back 30 years, and she read them with the same methodical attention she had watched him apply to everything. Page by page, date by date. She was looking for anything that could be distorted, anything with enough ambiguity that a man like Belmont could reshape it into something damaging. She was not looking to find nothing. She was looking to find everything, because finding everything first was the only defense against someone who intended to find something and use it badly. Aunt Harriet brought tea at midnight and did not tell her to stop. By 3 in the morning, Eleanor had read through 15 years of records and found exactly what she expected to find: a man who had conducted his professional life with almost punishing integrity. There were difficult years where the income from lectures and publications had not been sufficient, and he had borrowed small sums from colleagues, all meticulously documented, all repaid on schedule, with careful notes. There was one dispute from 12 years ago with a university press that had published one of his essays without proper attribution, which he had pursued through formal channels and won. There was nothing that could be distorted into financial misconduct without fabricating details wholesale. She sat back. The fabrication was the point she understood. Belmont did not need real ammunition. He needed enough suggestion of possible ammunition to create hesitation in Pemberton, the publisher in Alexander, in the social networks that governed reputation. A man of his position and patience understood that a whisper properly placed did not need to be true to be effective. She closed the last file. Then she sat very still and thought about her father, about a man who had refused to participate in political corruption and lost his fortune for it, who had spent the rest of his life writing the truth anyway, who had compiled 300 pages of honest, careful argument that a powerful man now intended to bury under a manufactured scandal, and she felt the anger from the previous evening crystallize into something harder and more useful. She was not going to let this happen quietly. She did not know yet exactly what she was going to do. But she knew she was going to do something, and she was going to do it herself, and she was going to do it before Belmont had the opportunity to move first. She went to bed at 4 o'clock. She was at her desk by 8. The letter she wrote that morning was not to Alexander. She thought about writing to him. She thought about it seriously, turning the question over with the same honesty she applied to everything, and she decided against it. Not because she did not trust him. Because what she was about to do was her decision to make, not his. Her father's name was her responsibility to protect. She was not going to hand that responsibility to someone else, however capable, however willing. She wrote to Alistair Pemberton directly. She had never written to him before. Alexander had conducted that correspondence. But she had read every letter in their exchange, had helped draft 2 of Alexander's responses, and she knew precisely what Pemberton valued: scholarly rigor, primary sources, and the specific courage of people who published inconvenient truths without asking permission from those who found them inconvenient. She wrote him 4 pages. She explained who she was. She explained the manuscript, its argument, its evidentiary basis, its significance. She explained Belmont's interference with her father's previous publication attempts, with specific dates and specific publishers she had documented from the files. She explained the letter that had arrived at her aunt's house, its contents, its method, what it was designed to accomplish, and why. She enclosed 3 of her father's original letters to the publishers who had declined under Belmont's pressure, which she had found in the files the previous night. She wrote, "My father spent 30 years producing honest work. He was stopped from publishing it through the systematic application of social and financial pressure by a man who found its conclusions threatening. I am not asking you to publish it as an act of charity. I am asking you to read it and make your own judgment. If you find it worthy on its merits, publish it. If Belmont then attempts to manufacture a scandal to undermine its reception, I am prepared to respond publicly with the documentation I have enclosed. I am not afraid of him. I am asking whether you are. She sealed it. She sent it by express post. Then she sat back and thought about what she had just done and whether she was going to regret it. She decided she was not. She sent a note to Alexander. Not about the letter, not yet. Simply come Thursday. There is something you need to know. He arrived Wednesday. She opened the door herself because she had seen the carriage from the window and reached the entrance before Thomas could. He looked at her face and said immediately, "What happened?" "I wrote to Pemberton directly," she said. He went very still. "When?" "Yesterday morning." He came inside. He did not sit down. He stood in the hallway with the particular stillness of a man processing something he had not expected. "What did you write?" she told him. All of it the night in the files, the assessment of her father's records, the decision, the 4 pages, the enclosed documents. He listened without interrupting. She watched his face move through several things in sequence: surprise, a sharp flash of something that might have been anxiety, something harder to name, and then settling something that looked like the feeling a person has when they realize someone has done exactly the right thing in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment. "You went to him directly," he said. "It is my father's work. It is my family's name." She met his eyes. "I was not going to manage this from behind you." "I wasn't going to suggest—" "I know you weren't," she said. "I'm explaining why I did it the way I did it, not apologizing." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am not asking for an apology." A pause. "What I am is, Eleanor, that letter was either the most effective thing anyone has done in this situation, or it is going to accelerate Belmont's response significantly. I know that. And you sent it anyway." "He was already moving," she said. "Waiting for him to define the terms of engagement was going to cost us time we don't have. I chose to define them ourselves." He held her gaze. Then he said quietly, "Your father would have done exactly that." "Yes," she said. "He would have." Something passed between them in the silence. The recognition of a shared understanding, the particular closeness of two people who have come to know each other well enough that some things do not require elaboration. "Now tell me what happened with Belmont," she said. He sat down. He ran one hand through his hair, a gesture she had never seen him make a break in the composure that was itself significant. "I went to him the evening I left here, directly. I did not arrange a meeting through social channels, because I did not want to give him time to prepare a particular version of the conversation." He paused. "He was not pleased to see me." "No, he wouldn't be." I was careful. He did not say anything that constituted an explicit threat. He talked about his respect for the peerage's role in maintaining social stability. He talked about the importance of scholarly work being understood in its proper political context. He talked— Alexander's voice took on a dry, controlled quality, at considerable length about the responsibility that men of influence carry to ensure that certain arguments do not destabilize institutions that protect a great many people. He said all of that without saying anything specific. "I is very good at that." Alexander looked at his hands. At the end of the conversation, I told him that I intended to support the publication of Professor Whitcombe's manuscript, that I had read it in its entirety, and that I found its scholarly arguments sound, and its evidence beyond reproach. I told him that if he had evidence to the contrary, he was welcome to publish a formal response through academic channels once the manuscript appeared. He paused. He asked me if I understood what I was risking. "And you said?" I said I had a very clear understanding of what I was risking and what I was choosing. He met her eyes. He said that was unfortunate, that a man in my position making that kind of choice would find certain alliances, his word alliances, difficult to maintain. He told you directly that he would move against you. In the specific language that allows him to later claim he said nothing of the kind. His voice was even. "Yes." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Alexander, the legislative alignment, The policy questions where you needed his support. What specifically are you going to lose? The Eastern Agricultural Reform Bill, he said. I have been working on it for 3 years. It requires coalition support, and Belmont chairs the committee. Without his alignment, it stalls. Eleanor felt the weight of this settle. That bill, she said. What does it do? It extends legal protections to tenant farmers in 3 northern counties. It changes the eviction procedures that have been used extensively by a number of estates to remove families from land. They have worked for generations whenever a more profitable use presents itself. He paused. It is not a radical piece of legislation. It is a modest one, but it is the right one. And if it stalls, the families it would have protected remain unprotected. The estates that have been using the current procedures continue to use them. He paused. Approximately 3,000 tenant families across those counties. The silence in the room was very specific. The silence of 2 people sitting with a real consequence. That, Eleanor said carefully, is not a small thing to lose. No, he agreed. It is not. And you are still standing where you were. Yes. He held her gaze. Because if I yield to Belmont now on this for this reason, I become the kind of man who allows honest work to be suppressed and honest people to be threatened because the cost of standing against it is too high. And that man... He stopped. That man cannot write meaningful legislation, Eleanor. That man cannot do anything that matters. Because everything that matters requires the willingness to pay a cost. She breathed. She thought about Chapter 11 of her father's manuscript. She thought about the argument he had made, the one Belmont found threatening, about the moral fiction of inherited right used as a substitute for actual responsibility. She thought about a man reading those words and understanding them well enough to live by them even when living by them was expensive. There may be another way, she said. He looked at her. The bill, she said. Who else is on the committee, besides Belmont? 7 members. 3 are reasonably independent. 2 are firmly Belmonts. 2 can be moved if the argument is strong enough. He paused. Without Belmont's chairmanship support, even moving all 4 independent and movable votes doesn't give me the majority. Who chairs the House Reform Subcommittee? He blinked. Lord Ashwick. Why? Because Ashwick spoke at my father's final university lecture, she said. I was there. He and my father corresponded for 6 years. He found my father's work on land stewardship obligations. I have his letters saying exactly that, among the most important scholarship of the decade. She met Alexander's eyes directly. He does not know the manuscript exists. No one outside this room and Pemberton and Belmont knows it exists. Alexander went very still. You are suggesting, he said slowly, that we bring Ashwick in before Belmont can define the manuscript as a political threat, before the framing is set. I am suggesting that a bill protecting tenant farmers would read very differently to a man who has already read and admired the scholarly framework that establishes the moral argument for that protection. She paused. My father built that argument over 30 years. The manuscript is its fullest expression. If Ashwick reads it before Belmont describes it to him, he forms his own judgment. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, with the expression she had come to think of as the real one, the unmanaged, fully present version of his attention. You have been thinking about this since yesterday morning, he said. I have been thinking about it since the night I read the files, she said. I just needed the Belmont conversation before I knew which part of it to use. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Ashwick will want to read the full manuscript. Yes. And if he finds it as significant as your father's correspondence suggests he will, then Belmont does not have a cooperative committee chairman. He has an adversarial one. She held his gaze. I am not saying this solves everything. I am saying it changes the shape of the problem. He stood up. He was already thinking she could see it the way the intelligence moved behind his eyes when he was working through something real. I need to arrange to meet Ashwick privately, he said, before Belmont has any reason to speak to him. How quickly can you do that? Today, he said. If I leave now. Then leave now, she said. He looked at her. One more time, the full, unguarded look. You changed the entire shape of this, he said. My father changed it, she said. "I just found where it applied." He left. She listened to the carriage. Pemberton's response arrived 4 days later. It was 3 pages long, written in the direct, precise style of a man who had been publishing important work for 20 years and knew exactly what he was looking at when he saw it. He had read Eleanor's letter. He had read the enclosed documentation. He had reviewed the chapters of the manuscript that Alexander had previously forwarded. He wrote, "This is the most important work of land stewardship ethics produced in England in the past 50 years. I should have received it 3 years ago. The fact that I did not tells me everything I need to know about the nature of the opposition to it. I intend to publish it. I intend to publish it this autumn. If Lord Belmont wishes to respond through academic channels, he is welcome to do so. I do not expect he will find that venue comfortable. Miss Whitcombe, your father was remarkable. So I am beginning to think are you." Eleanor read it standing at the hallway table. She set it down. She picked it up again. She sat down on the hallway bench where she had no business sitting and held the letter in her hands. She was not going to cry. She managed this through the application of the same will she applied to everything else. But she sat for a moment in the hallway with Pemberton's words. Your father was remarkable, and she felt the truth of it, move through her, the way things move through you, when they reach a place that has been waiting for them without knowing it was waiting. He had been remarkable, and now his work was going to exist in the world. She breathed. Then she got up, went to her desk, and wrote 3 letters. One to Pemberton, accepting with her full authorization and asking about timeline and process. One to Alexander, telling him about Pemberton's response in full. And one the third, which she had not planned when she sat down to the Dowager Duchess of Wexford. This letter was short. She wrote, Your Grace. You asked me to think carefully. I have. I want you to know that I understand what is at stake for your son and for your family. I also want you to know that I will not allow the demands of those stakes to make me someone smaller than I am, because a smaller version of me would not be the person your son has chosen. I hope in time you will see that what he has chosen is someone who intends to stand beside him, not behind him, and not in front of him, but beside him in all of it. I respect you too much to tell you only what you want to hear. This is what is true. She sealed it. She sent it. She sat for a moment alone with the clarity of a person who has said the true thing and does not know yet how it will be received, and has decided to live with that uncertainty, rather than soften the truth to make it easier. Aunt Harriet came in with tea. You've been busy, she said, looking at the 3 sealed letters on the desk. Yes. Pemberton said yes. Yes. And you wrote to the Duchess? I did. Aunt Harriet set the tea down. She did not ask what the letter said. She sat down across from Eleanor and looked at her niece with the full, warm, complicated attention of a woman who had known this particular person for 27 years and loved her with the specific love that comes from knowing someone completely and choosing them anyway. Your father, she said, would be very proud of you. Eleanor held herself very still. Thank you, she said. Her voice was entirely steady. I mean it. I know you do. They sat together in the quiet with the tea, and Eleanor thought about all of it. Pemberton's letter and Belmont's maneuvering, and Alexander in a meeting with Lord Ashwick at this very moment, and the Dowager Duchess who had called at this house and said true things that deserved a true answer, and a trunk full of 300 pages that were about to become real in the world. She thought about what her father had always said about documents. The truth survives eventually. It needs patience, and someone willing to look after it. That's all. Just patience and care, and the willingness not to let it disappear. She had been looking after it. Alexander's note arrived the following morning. It was brief. His notes always were when they carried significant information, as though he had learned to trust precision over elaboration in the moments that mattered most. Ashwick read chapters 1 through 5 last night. He sent a messenger at 7 this morning asking for the remainder. He also asked through his private secretary whether I would be available to discuss the Eastern Agricultural Reform Bill at my earliest convenience. I believe the shape of the problem has changed. I will come Thursday. There is something I want to ask you, and I want to ask it correctly. Eleanor read it twice. She noticed the last 2 lines. She noticed them the way she noticed things that required careful handling with full attention, without rushing toward a conclusion she had not yet earned. She set the note in the box. The box was very full now. She had thought several months ago that she might need a larger one. She had been right. Thursday arrived, and with it rain. The particular English spring rain that is not dramatic but is very thorough, the kind that settles in and intends to stay. It suited the day, Eleanor thought. It suited the feeling of a situation that had been building for months and was now very close to the moment where all the careful work either held or it didn't. He arrived at 2 o'clock. She did not wait for Thomas. She opened the door herself. He stood on the step with rain on his coat, and something in his expression she had not seen before, not managed, not controlled, not arranged into any version of presentation. Simply open. The way a man looks when he has made a decision, and the decision has settled in him, and he is no longer carrying the weight of making it. "Come in," she said. He came in. He did not remove his coat immediately. He stood in the hallway and looked at her and said without sitting down, without the careful sequencing she had come to expect from him, "Ashwick is going to support the bill. He told me yesterday evening. He has also agreed to approach the 2 movable committee members directly, which he believes will be sufficient." He paused. The bill moves forward. Belmont loses the chairmanship influence. His opposition becomes visible rather than invisible, which is considerably less effective. And the publication. Pemberton moves forward. Belmont can object publicly if he chooses. Ashwick has indicated that a public scholarly dispute about the manuscript's arguments given his own position would not go well for Belmont's side. He paused. It is not a complete resolution. Belmont will find other ways to apply pressure over time. But the immediate crisis is it is contained. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "The tenant families." 3,000, he said. "Yes, and your legislative alignment with Belmont." "Is over," he said. "Completely. I ended it formally yesterday morning before I met with Ashwick. I did not want the meeting to be contingent on what Belmont had or had not yet done. The ending was its own decision." She held his gaze. "That cost you?" "Yes." He was entirely clear about this. "It did. There will be consequences I have not yet fully mapped. Other alliances that depended on that one. Political arrangements that will need to be renegotiated." He paused. "I have been making a list. It is long." "And you?" "I made the list, and I was not sorry," he said quietly. "That is the honest answer. I was not sorry." Eleanor breathed. "Aunt Harriet," she said, raising her voice slightly. From the sitting room. "Yes." "Would you mind terribly?" "I am already in the other room," Aunt Harriet said with the dignity of a woman who has anticipated her cue. The sitting room door closed gently. Eleanor looked at Alexander. He reached into his coat. He produced a small box, plain dark wood, no elaborate presentation. He held it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything that mattered. "I told you," he said, "that I wanted to ask you something, and that I wanted to ask it correctly." He held her gaze. "The correctly part I have now decided means this: I am not asking because you are suitable, or because the situation is resolved, or because the timing is convenient. I am asking because I want to spend the rest of my life in conversation with you. Because you are the most honest person I have ever known, and you have made me more honest in knowing you. Because you sent a letter to Pemberton on your own authority, and spent a night reading financial files, and wrote to my mother with more dignity than most people manage in their best moments, and I was not there for any of it, and you did not need me to be, and that is—" He stopped. He found the words. "That is who you are, and it is the person I want beside me. Not behind me. Beside me." He paused. "Your words to my mother. I read her letter. I know what you wrote." "I meant it," Eleanor said. "I know you did." He opened the box. The ring was simple, a deep blue stone, dark and clear, set in plain gold. Not a jewel designed to announce itself. A jewel designed to last. "I am asking whether you will marry me. Not the title, not the estate, not what any of it requires. Me." The man who argues with himself in the margins because he cannot trust his own conclusions. Eleanor looked at the ring. She looked at him. 27 years of calibrating herself against everyone else's requirements. 27 years of knowing her worth precisely in the ways that other people did not know it. 27 years of being her father's daughter, which meant never lying to herself, never taking the comfortable answer when the true one was available. She knew the true answer. She had known it for some time. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit, which she registered as the small, perfect thing that it was. He held her hand for a moment, both his hands around hers, the same gesture he had made at their first meeting when he had stopped her from retreating, turned it into something warm and deliberate and completely his own. "Eleanor," he said, her name in his voice with all the weight of everything they had built, placed carefully inside it. "I know," she said. From the other room, Aunt Harriet produced what was definitively not a sound related to her tea. Alexander looked at the sitting room door. The almost smile arrived full and genuine and entirely unmanaged. "She has excellent timing." "She always does," Eleanor said. "It is one of her most reliable qualities." She looked at the ring on her hand, then at him. "The Dowager Duchess," she said. "She will need to know. She already suspects. She told me 3 days ago to stop being cowardly about it." He paused. Her word. Cowardly. She was right. "Yes," he agreed. "She was." A pause. "My mother is frequently right about facts. She is occasionally wrong about what to do with them." "She will come around," Eleanor said. "She already has. Somewhat." He paused. "She told me in the same conversation that you had written to her with her exact phrase was, 'a great deal more spine than I was prepared for.' I believe she meant it as a compliment." "I will choose to interpret it that way," Eleanor said. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Not the social version of a look, the real one. The one she had first seen across a ballroom when he had walked past every suitable woman in the room and stopped in front of her. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I said at the ball. That I came searching for someone I believed no longer existed." "I remember. I owe you the full version of that sentence." He held her gaze. "I came searching for someone who would look at me and see a man trying to be worth something. Not a title, not an inheritance. A man making choices and trying to make them correctly." He paused. "My father was that kind of man, and he died when I was 22. And I spent 14 years trying to be him, without anyone who had known him to tell me whether I was managing it." Eleanor felt the truth of it move through her. She did not look away. "Your father's work," he said quietly, "was the closest thing I had. For 14 years. He paused. "And then I found his daughter." She held his gaze. "You are managing it," she said. "Correctly. Your father would have, I didn't know him, and I know he would have been proud of you." He breathed. It was the breath she had heard him take before the one that meant something large was being released. But this time, it did not sound like control. It sounded like relief, like a man who has been holding something heavy for 14 years and has finally found somewhere safe enough to set it down. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, Aunt Harriet made no further sounds, which was its own form of grace. Eleanor stood in the hallway of her aunt's house with a ring on her hand and the full, unmanaged attention of a man who had chosen her, not because she was safe, not because she was suitable, not because she completed a list, but because she was the truest version of what he had been looking for when he had crossed the length of a ballroom in March and stopped in front of a woman in a simple dress. She thought about her father. She thought about what he had written in the last lines of Chapter 11, in the argument that Belmont had tried to bury, and that Pemberton was now going to publish for the world to read. The truest measure of a man is not what he inherits. It is what he chooses to protect when protecting it costs him something real. A man who has not yet paid that cost does not yet know who he is. A man who has paid it and not flinched, that man knows exactly who he is. And so do the people who were watching. She had been watching. She knew exactly who he was. The engagement was announced on a Tuesday, not through the social channels that London expected, not through a carefully worded notice delivered first to the right drawing rooms, not through the orchestrated whisper campaign that turned a duke's personal decision into a season's most managed piece of news. Alexander sent the formal notice to the papers directly, without prior circulation, which meant that half of London read it over their morning tea before anyone had the opportunity to prepare a reaction. Eleanor heard about the reactions secondhand, and mostly through Aunt Harriet, who received 3 morning calls within 48 hours from women who came ostensibly to offer congratulations and actually to assess the situation firsthand. Eleanor received each of them with the same composed pleasantness she had always brought to social occasions, direct, warm, entirely without performance. And when Lady Pemberton arrived on the second day with Miss Cecilia Pemberton, and a smile so carefully arranged it had clearly been practiced, Eleanor looked at her and said, before she had fully sat down, "Lady Pemberton, how kind of you to come." The specific quality of those 5 words, warm, gracious, and containing the precise acknowledgement that both women in the room understood the full context of this visit, produced a silence of approximately 2 seconds before Lady Pemberton recovered and began to say something about how she had always believed Miss Whitcombe was a remarkable young woman. Eleanor listened to this with the attention of someone who has decided to be generous about the gap between what people say and what they mean. "You are very kind," she said, and left it there. Lady Pemberton left earlier than expected for the second time. Aunt Harriet came into the sitting room after she'd gone and looked at Eleanor with the full warmth of a woman who had watched her niece manage 27 years of social invisibility and was now watching her manage sudden visibility with exactly the same quality of self-possession. "You were remarkably restrained," she said. "She came," Eleanor said. "That was the thing that mattered. Not why she came or what she said while she was here. She came." She paused. "That is the beginning of something different, even if the beginning is not pure." Aunt Harriet looked at her for a long moment. "Your father used to say that." "I know," Eleanor said. "He said it about documents. He said the fact of a thing surviving was the first and most important truth about it. Everything else came second." She stood up and went to her desk, and she sat down, and she thought about what she had just said. She thought about survival as a first truth. She thought about a woman who had spent 27 years surviving social invisibility and a man who had spent 14 years surviving the weight of inherited responsibility, and how both of them had arrived at the same ballroom on a Tuesday evening in March and found in the most unexpected configuration possible someone who was surviving the same direction. The Dowager Duchess came to call on Friday. This was not a surprise. Eleanor had been expecting it since the engagement announcement had been calculating the likely timing, had prepared herself for the version of the visit that would require the most careful navigation. She had been wrong about the version. The Dowager Duchess arrived without her social armor. This was not immediately obvious. She still carried herself with the authority of a woman who had never been required to apologize for existing. But Eleanor recognized the difference within the first 3 minutes. The precision was still there. The directness was still there. But something that had been present at their first meeting, a quality of assessment, the feeling of being evaluated against a set of criteria she did not meet, was gone. "Miss Whitcombe," the Dowager Duchess said. "Your Grace. You wrote me a letter." "I did. I read it 4 times. She sat down. She looked at Eleanor directly. "My son asked me when I told him I intended to call on you what he wished me to say. He said whatever is true." A pause. "I found that irritating." "Did you?" Eleanor said with the careful neutrality of someone managing a smile. "Because it gave me no guidance whatsoever." The Dowager Duchess's voice shifted very slightly. "He has been saying true things his whole life. He learned it from his father. It has made him very admirable and occasionally very difficult to argue with." She paused again. "You also say true things." "Yes. Your letter was the most direct communication I have received from a young woman in 30 years of London seasons." The Dowager Duchess held her gaze. "I want you to know that I read it as it was intended, not as impertinence, as honesty." "I meant it as honesty," Eleanor said. "I know. That is why I am here." She was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about you. Not about the facts I cited were accurate, but about what the facts meant." She paused, and Eleanor could see that this cost her something, not a large thing, but something real, the small real cost that honest self-correction always carries. I have watched my son for 14 years carry everything this family requires without once asking for anything for himself. I have been so accustomed to him not asking that. When he finally did, I responded to the asking as a threat rather than as what it was. Eleanor was very still. What was it? She asked quietly. Evidence, the Dowager Duchess said, that he had finally found something worth asking for. The sitting room was very quiet. I am glad he asked, Eleanor said. Yes. The older woman looked at her. So am I. Now. She paused. I wanted to tell you that directly, rather than allowing you to infer it from my attendance at the wedding. I appreciate the directness. I thought you would. Something moved in the Dowager Duchess's expression, not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement that one was possible, and that she was choosing to allow it. You are going to be an unusual duchess. Almost certainly, Eleanor agreed. I mean it as a compliment. I am choosing to receive it that way. The Dowager Duchess looked at her for a moment, and then she did something Eleanor had not expected. She laughed. Not a social laugh, not the polished, calibrated response of a woman performing warmth, a genuine one, brief and real. The laugh of someone who has been surprised into it. Yes, she said. I think we will manage. After she left, Aunt Harriet appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who had been listening from the hallway and was making no apologies for it. She laughed, Aunt Harriet said. She did. The Dowager Duchess of Wexford laughed in my sitting room. Yes. Eleanor. Aunt Harriet pressed her hands together. I think everything is going to be all right. I think so too, Eleanor said. I have thought so for some time. I was simply waiting for the evidence to confirm it. Pemberton's publication notice arrived 3 weeks later. It was a formal announcement, the kind that went to scholarly journals and academic societies, and the publications that circulated among the educated class who followed the serious discourse of the day. Professor William Whitcombe's manuscript, The Moral Obligations of Inherited Stewardship, a historical and ethical examination, would be published in the autumn by Pemberton Academic Press of Edinburgh. The announcement included a preface written by Lord Ashwick, who described the work as the most significant contribution to the ethics of land governance in 50 years, and expressed his personal regret that it had not reached publication sooner. Ashwick had written that preface without being asked. He had sent it to Pemberton directly with a brief note explaining that he wished to be publicly associated with the work, and that if anyone found that association inconvenient, they were welcome to say so to his face. No one said so to his face. Belmont said nothing publicly at all, which was itself a statement, the specific silence of a man who has calculated that any response he makes to a situation now draws more attention to it than ignoring it does. Eleanor had expected this. She had watched her father navigate the same calculation from the opposite side years ago, and she understood the mechanics of it. Belmont would not disappear. He would reconfigure. He would find other leverage over time, approach things differently, move through channels that were less visible. He was patient. She knew this. She was also patient. She had been patient for 27 years. She could continue. The wed was in September. Eleanor had decided on September because it was the month her father had always said was the best one, the month that had made its mind up about being autumn without yet having committed to the cold, the month of harvests completed, and accounts settled, the month of honest endings and honest beginnings. Alexander had agreed to September without asking why. This was one of the things she had come to love about him most specifically. Not the grand gestures, not the moments of sacrifice that London would eventually hear about and find impressive, but the small ones. The way he said yes to September, because he could hear that September mattered without needing to know all the reasons. The way he showed up when he said he would. The way he had quietly, and without announcement, arranged for the first printing of her father's manuscript to be dedicated to her, had written to Pemberton about it before telling her, so that when she found out it was already done. She had found out on the Thursday afternoon. She had read the dedication page that Pemberton had sent for her review, to Eleanor Whitcombe Hawthorne, who found it, who fought for it, and who always understood what it was worth. W.W. She had sat with it for a long time. She had understood that her father had not written that dedication. Pemberton had composed it based on everything he knew of the situation, written in a voice that felt true to the man he had never met, but had come to know through his work. It was not her father's words. It was the words his work had earned, spoken by someone who had received that work with the honesty it deserved. She had held it the way she held everything that mattered. Then she had gone to find Alexander and said when she found him in his study, the dedication. He looked up. He met her eyes. He said nothing, which was the correct thing. "Thank you," she said. "It was Pemberton's idea," he said. "I only told him it was right." "I know." She looked at him. "Thank you for knowing it was right." He held her gaze. "Always," he said. She had filed that word carefully. She intended to keep it. The ceremony was small by the standards of what a ducal wedding could have been and was not. Alexander had offered her the full London occasion, the cathedral, the guest list of 300, the social event of the season that the papers would cover extensively, and that would announce the new Duchess of Wexford to society with appropriate ceremony. Eleanor had considered it honestly and declined. "I would like," she had said, "to get married in the way that means something to us, rather than in the way that means something to everyone who is watching." He had agreed immediately. They were married in the village church near Wexford Estate on a Saturday morning in September with Aunt Harriet and the Dowager Duchess, and Thomas the estate manager, and Ashwick and Pemberton, who had come from Edinburgh because Alexander had written to tell him the date, and Pemberton had written back, "I will be there. Your father-in-law's work built this, and I intend to witness the occasion of someone reading it correctly." The Dowager Duchess sat in the front row beside Aunt Harriet, and at some point during the ceremony, Eleanor became aware from the corner of her vision that the two women were speaking quietly to each other in the manner of people who have discovered unexpectedly that they have a great deal in common. She filed this with the specific quiet satisfaction of someone who recognizes a good development and trusts it to continue without her active management. Alexander looked at her during the ceremony with the full, unguarded attention she had come to think of as his most important quality. The willingness to look at what was actually there without the social overlay, without the managed distance, simply and completely present. She looked back at him the same way. The vicar spoke. They answered when required. The thing was done and real and settled. She was the Duchess of Wexford. The feeling of it was not what she had expected. Not grand, not overwhelming, not the dizzying shift of identity that she had been slightly braced for. It felt instead like the feeling her father had described when he finished a book he had been working on for years. Not completion exactly, but rightness. The specific quality of a thing that has arrived where it was going. She was the Duchess of Wexford, and she was Eleanor Whitcombe, and neither of those things required her to be less of the other. The Eastern Agricultural Reform Bill passed in October. Ashwick had delivered 3 of the 4 votes Alexander needed. The 4th came from an unexpected direction. Lord Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's husband, who had apparently read the first published copies of William Whitcomb's manuscript, and had sent a letter to Alexander, explaining with the particular terseness of a man who is admitting something he would rather not, that the argument in Chapter 7 had changed his understanding of his own estate's tenant arrangements, and that he intended to vote accordingly. Eleanor read Alexander's account of this letter twice, and felt something that was less surprise than recognition. "My father would find that very funny," she said. His daughter's engagement prompting Lady Pemberton's husband to read the manuscript that changed his vote on the bill that protects 3,000 tenant families, Alexander said. "There is a certain geometry to it. He always said that ideas move through the world in ways you could not predict and should not try to control," Eleanor said. "He said the only thing you could do was put the honest ones out and trust them to find where they were needed." She paused. He was right. The manuscript had been in the world for 3 weeks by then, and the response had been not explosive because serious scholarly work rarely produced explosions. It produced something more durable: conversation. Ashwick had written about it in a parliamentary speech. 2 universities had requested copies for their libraries. A reviewer in one of the serious periodicals had called it the most rigorous work of land ethics since the previous century. A second reviewer, in a publication that was associated with Belmont's sphere of influence, had called it politically motivated scholarship, and Ashwick had responded publicly in print in 2 paragraphs that were so precisely constructed and so thoroughly sourced that the response had attracted more attention than the original criticism. Belmont had not responded to Ashwick's response. The silence was its own answer. Eleanor had watched all of this from the position she had always occupied, not at the center, not performing, but present, paying attention, understanding what was happening and what it meant. She had always been good at that. She was finding that the position of Duchess of Wexford did not change that quality so much as give it more room to operate. She had begun in November to write, not scholarly work, not yet. Though she had thoughts that she was assembling carefully in the margins of other things, in the specific way she had learned from her father, of building an argument slowly from the ground up, without deciding where it was going, before the evidence was ready to tell her. What she was writing in November was simpler. A series of letters to women in the 3 northern counties affected by the Agricultural Reform Bill, coordinated through Thomas, who had a network of estate contacts that was considerably more extensive than she had initially understood. Letters that explained in plain language what the bill's tenant protections meant in practice, what they could claim, who to speak to if those protections were not honored. She had not asked Alexander's permission. She had told him what she was doing on a Tuesday evening in November, when they were sitting together in the library after dinner, in the easy quiet that had become her favorite part of their days, the part that required nothing of either of them except presence. "I'm writing to the tenants in the northern counties," she said, through Thomas's network, explaining the practical implications of the bill. He looked up from what he was reading. "How many letters?" he said. "Approximately 40 to start. The estate managers who can distribute them appropriately." He held her gaze. "What do you need from me?" "Thomas's full contact list," she said, "and your formal endorsement on the letter, so they understand it comes from the estate and not from a woman sending unsolicited correspondence." "You have it," he said. "Both things." She nodded. She went back to her writing. He went back to his reading. After a moment, he said without looking up, "Your father built the argument. You are making it walk." She considered this. "Someone has to make ideas walk," she said. "Otherwise they sit in manuscripts and mean very little." "I know," he said. "I have been watching you do it for months." A pause. "I have been trying to learn from it." She looked at him across the library. The man who had walked the length of a ballroom to stop in front of a woman in a simple dress. The man who had read her father 11 times and kept the margin notes and argued with himself because he could not trust conclusions he had not tested. The man who had told his mother before he proposed that he was going to do it, and had listened to her objections and had said, "I understand all of it. I am still certain." She had been certain too. She had simply needed to be honest with herself about it before she could say so. "You are better at it than you think," she said. He looked at her. "The walking of ideas," she said. "The bill. The Ashwick approach. The way you handled Belmont, not with direct confrontation, but by changing the landscape around him, so that the confrontation was already won before he fully understood it was happening." She paused. "That is not a legal strategy. That is an ethical one. My father wrote about it in Chapter 4. He wrote that the most durable form of influence is not the kind that compels," Alexander said slowly. "It is the kind that persuades by demonstrating concretely what the better version of things looks like. You were doing that before you read the chapter." "I was doing it badly before I read the chapter," he said. "Your father gave me the language for it, which made it possible to do it more deliberately." He paused. "That is what good ideas do, I think. They don't give you the ability. They show you that the ability was already there and you were not using it correctly." Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at him with the full considered attention she gave to things that mattered. "He would have liked you so much," she said. Something moved through Alexander's face, the same movement she had seen in him at their very first meeting, the one beneath the surface, the tectonic thing that happened when something reached a place that had been waiting for it. "I know," he said quietly. "I think about that sometimes. What the conversation would have been." "He would have argued with you in the margins," she said. "I hope so." A pause. "I have kept the annotated volumes. I still read them." "Which reading is this?" I thought about it. "The 12th. She smiled. Not the composed, managed version she had practiced over 27 years of social navigation. The real one, full and unguarded, the smile of a woman who is entirely where she is supposed to be and knows it. "What do you find on the 12th reading?" she asked. "Things I missed on the 11th, he said. "That is always how it goes." She picked up her pen again. He went back to his book. The fire settled. The library was warm and quiet, and full of the specific quality of a room that is actually lived in. Not performed, not maintained for appearances, but genuinely occupied by people who find it the right place to think. Outside Wexford Estate continued its business. The tenant families of the northern counties had begun to receive Eleanor's letters. Pemberton was preparing a second printing of the manuscript the first had sold through within a month, which had surprised Pemberton and not surprised Eleanor at all, because she had understood from the beginning that her father's work was not difficult. It was simply honest and honest. Things found their audience eventually, if you were patient enough. Belmont had 2 weeks prior declined an invitation to a parliamentary dinner that Ashwick had organized. This was noted and discussed in certain circles. Eleanor had heard about it through Thomas, who heard about everything through channels that she was beginning to understand ran considerably deeper than the surface of things. She had filed it carefully. Belmont was receding from a particular kind of public contest. How was not defeated? A man like Belmont did not experience defeat in the clean, complete way that word implied. He was repositioning. He was patient. She was more patient. The Hartwell Winter Banquet was announced in early December. The invitations arrived to Wexford House, now addressed to both of them, the Duke and Duchess of Wexford, which was a fact that Aunt Harriet had found quietly and thoroughly delightful when Eleanor told her. Eleanor had set the invitation on Alexander's desk and waited. He had looked at it. He had looked at her. He had said, "Do you want to go?" She had thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." He had raised an eyebrow. "Not to demonstrate anything," she said. "Not to collect whatever recognition the room decides to offer. I want to go because 9 months ago I stood at the edge of that ballroom in a dress I was slightly ashamed of, and you crossed the room to speak to me, and I want to go back and stand in the same room and feel what that is like now." She paused. "I think I have earned that." He had looked at her for a moment with the expression she knew best, the one that saw all of it and found it exactly right. "We will go," he said. She wore the same dress. This was a decision she had made privately before telling him, and when he saw her in it, he had gone very still for a moment, and then said nothing, which was the correct response, which told her that he understood. She wore the ivory dress 4 years old, precisely as it had always been. She wore no elaborate jewelry. She wore the single ring on her left hand, the dark blue stone set in plain gold, and that was enough. That was the whole statement made without being designed as a statement. They arrived together. The room was the same room. The marble floors, the high ceilings, the candlelight, the music. The same social machinery assembling itself around the same annual purpose. And around the edges of that same room, the particular quality of a large group of people registering the entrance of 2 specific individuals and recalibrating quickly and thoroughly everything they believed they understood about the situation. Lady Hartwell received them at the door with warmth that was entirely genuine. Eleanor had come to understand that Lady Hartwell's warmth was always genuine. The social calculation was separate from it. They coexisted without contradiction. Lady Hargrove was there near the fireplace in deep green, and she caught Eleanor's eye from across the room and nodded with a precision that communicated several things simultaneously, none of which required elaboration. Lady Pemberton was there. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Then she looked at the ring. Then she looked at Alexander. Then she looked back at Eleanor with an expression that had moved Eleanor thought some distance toward something genuine. "Your Grace," she said. "Lady Pemberton," Eleanor said warmly. The room did not hold a full silence this time. There was no dramatic pause, no collective breath, no performance of a room confronting something it did not expect. What there was instead was the quieter and more durable thing, a room that had reassembled its understanding of who Eleanor Whitcombe was and what she had become, and what that meant, and was now proceeding on the basis of that reassembled understanding. It was not universal. There were people at the edges of the room who were still calculating, still positioning. There were people who had not yet decided how to feel about the Duke's unusual marriage. This was fine. Eleanor had no interest in universal approval. She had never had that interest. What she had was the knowledge of her own worth carried clearly, offered without apology, extended without demand. That had always been enough. Alexander put his hand at her back, the light, steady pressure she had come to know as his version of being beside her, and they moved through the room together, and the room moved around them, and it was nothing like the first time, and entirely the same. Toward the end of the evening, they found themselves near the library doors. The same library doors. Alexander looked at them, then at her. "This is where you were standing," he said. "Yes." She looked at the exact spot. Sir Edmund Graves was explaining a Flemish cartographic atlas. "And you were more interested in that than in being seen." "Significantly more interested," she said. "He was a very good source on Flemish cartography." "I know," Alexander said. "I spoke to him afterward. He told me you had asked 3 questions that none of his academic colleagues had thought to ask." A pause. That was the moment I understood I had not been wrong. Eleanor looked at him. "About what?" "About you." He held her gaze with the full, steady attention that had never changed, that had been the same in the beginning and was the same now, the same quality of someone genuinely trying to see what was actually there. "I walked across that room because I had read your father's work, and I wanted to find the person who came from it. I stayed because of what I found when I arrived." He paused. "Those are 2 different things. I want you to always know I understand the difference." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I know," she said. "I have always known." "Good." The music changed. Something slower, warmer. The music of the later part of an evening, when the social performance has relaxed into something more like genuine gathering. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes. Dance with me." She looked at him. He did not dance. She had heard him say this 9 months ago at this same event to Lady Hartwell. She knew it was true. He had not danced in years for reasons he had told her once quietly in the library at Wexford. His father had taught him, and he had found after his father died, that dancing in public felt like carrying something private into the wrong room. He was asking her to dance. "You don't dance," she said. "I don't dance with most people," he said. "That is a different statement." She looked at him for the moment. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. They moved to the floor, not in the center at the edge, which was where she had always been most comfortable, and which was, she had come to understand also, where he was most honest. Not performing, not demonstrating. Simply present with each other in the room where it had started. I was not a graceful dancer. She had expected this, and she did not mind it. He moved with the carefulness of a man who is doing something that matters to him and is unwilling to do it badly, which produced something that was not technically elegant and was entirely sincere, and she found that she preferred sincerity in this, as in everything. "You are thinking," he said. "I am always thinking." "About what?" She thought about how to answer honestly. "About how different this feels from the last time I was in this room," she said. "Not the room, the way I am in it." "How are you in it?" She considered. "Like myself," she said. "Completely. Without the parts I used to leave at the door." He held her gaze while they moved. "What parts did you leave at the door?" "The parts that wanted things," she said simply. "For a long time I was very good at not wanting things I didn't believe I was allowed to want. It was protective. It worked." She paused. It made me smaller than I actually was, and I let it because smaller felt safer. And now I am the full size," she said. "It is somewhat less safe and considerably better." He looked at her with the expression that she intended she thought to keep for the rest of her life, because it was the expression that said, without any words required, I see you. The full size. All of it. And I am not going anywhere. Your father wrote, Alexander said quietly as they moved, that a life of deliberate smallness was not humility. It was a failure of nerve disguised as virtue. Chapter 2, she said. Margin note page 47. Yes. He wrote that in this early draft, she said. He almost cut it. He thought it was too harsh. She paused. I told him to keep it. Alexander looked at her. You told him to keep it. He read me the draft at dinner. I was 19. I said that is the truest thing in the chapter, don't remove it just because it's uncomfortable. She felt the memory of it. Her father's expression, the way he had looked at her across the dinner table with the specific pride of a man whose child has said the right thing without knowing how right it was. He kept it. Because of you, Alexander said. Because it was true, she said. I just confirmed that it was. He held her gaze. You have been doing that your whole life, he said, confirming that true things are true, even when it costs something to confirm them. So have you, she said. The bill. Belmont. The conversation with your mother. She paused. The conversation you had with yourself before you asked me. That conversation was the hardest one, he said quietly. I know, she said. I could see it. Could you? Yes, I watched you be honest with yourself in real time over several months. It was not comfortable to watch. It was one of the things I admire most about you, actually. That you did not stop when it became uncomfortable. I almost stopped, he said. I know that too. What made you sure I wouldn't? She thought about it genuinely. The margin notes, she said finally. A man who argues with his own conclusions in the margins of other people's books 11 times for 14 years, that man does not stop when the truth becomes inconvenient. He has already proven repeatedly that he knows how to sit with an uncomfortable truth until he understands it. She paused. I trusted the evidence. I was quiet for a moment. The music moved. The room moved around them, warm and full of its own life. Eleanor, he said. Yes. I am going to read it a 13th time, he said. Your father's work. What do you expect to find? Things I missed on the 12th, he said. As always. He looked at her. And things that will mean different things now, because I am reading them from a different life. She held his gaze. She thought about her father's last lines, the ones she had carried through all of this. The truest measure of a man is not what he inherits. It is what he chooses to protect when protecting it costs him something real. She thought about what Alexander had protected. The bill and the tenants and his mother's honest assessment and the truth of his own feelings carried carefully and spoken when he was certain and not before. She thought about what she had protected. Her father's work and her own worth and the quality of her own judgment in a world that had spent 27 years trying to persuade her that the judgment of others should matter more. She thought about what they were building together, not the title, not the estate, not the social position that the room around them was busy recalibrating itself to accommodate. What they were actually building. The real thing made of honest conversations and margin notes and letters to tenant families and Thursday afternoons and a box full of correspondence that had grown too large for its original purpose. A life of the full size. Both of them. The music reached the end of its piece and settled into a brief, warm silence before the next began. Alexander looked at her. We should go back, he said. Lady Hartwell will be wondering. Yes, she agreed. But neither of them moved immediately. In his private journal, Alexander said, I intend to write. He stopped. He started again more precisely. When I write in my journal about this evening, I am going to write what I should have written 9 months ago after the first ball. That I walked across the room because I had been searching for someone who looked at the world honestly. And that when I found her, she was wearing a simple dress and having the most interesting conversation in the room. He paused. And that this was not a coincidence. That the dress and the conversation were the same statement made 2 different ways. Eleanor looked at him. What statement, she said. That she knew exactly what she was worth, he said, and she did not need the room's opinion of it. She stood with that for a moment. Then she said, "He wrote about that too, my father, in the final chapter. He wrote that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who is not performing their worth for the room's benefit, because they cannot be threatened by its withholding." "I know the passage," he said. "I read it last night." 12th reading. 12th reading. The almost smile-full, now entirely unmanaged the version she had been seeing for months and never tired of. "I think it was written about you." "It was written about a principle," she said. "I happen to have spent 27 years learning to live it." "Same thing," he said. She looked at him. Then she put her hand in his arm. The way she had learned was their way, easy and steady. Neither of them pulling both of them, simply moving in the same direction. And they walked back into the warmth of the room through the candlelight and the music through the room that had seen her as a joke 9 months ago and was now seeing her as herself. The same woman, the full size. And beside her, the man who had been the first one in that room to look carefully enough to see it. She had come to the Hartwell ball in a simple dress, and she had been sent across it as a punchline, and she had walked toward a man everyone feared, and she had sat down, and she had stayed. That was the beginning of the story. This was not the end of it. This was simply the moment when the story became the life, and the life became the thing that was worth telling. Not because it had been dramatic or extraordinary, or because the obstacles had been impossibly large, but because two people had looked at each other honestly and found in that honesty something that neither of them had known they were missing until it arrived. A man who had inherited everything and understood nothing of what mattered, until a woman in a simple dress sat beside him and told him the truth. A woman who had survived by making herself small and then chose deliberately to be the full size. And between them, in the margins, in the letters, in the conversations on Thursday afternoons, and the evenings in the library, and the dance at the edge of the floor, a life built not from what the world expected, but from what they had both finally had the courage to want. There it was. There it had always been.